He came home after a year away, longing only to see his mother and his loyal dog again. But in the heart of a bright northern town, he found them begging for scraps, thin and humiliated, clinging to each other to survive. His mother lowered her head in shame, while the German shepherd still stood guard beside her like a soldier who refused to abandon his post. The sight shattered him, and tears came before words ever could. That was the moment the former SEAL swore he would uncover the truth and reclaim everything stolen from the ones he loved. And the dog, carrying a memory no liar could erase, began leading him towards secrets that would shake the entire town. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from, and don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe. The light over Brightwater looked wrong. Not dark, not stormy, not cruel in any ordinary way. It was too clean for cruelty, too bright for grief. Early winter sunlight spread across the small northern town like polished glass, turning the lake beyond Main Street into a blue mirror, so still it seemed afraid to breathe. Tall pines ringed the water and the outer roads, unmoving in the cold, their shadows laid long and thin across the ground like old witnesses who had seen too much and spoken too little. Elias Vance drove into that light with both hands steady on the wheel. At 45, Elias still carried his body the way some men carried a rank long after the uniform had been folded away. He stood 6'1", broad-shouldered, hard through the chest and arms in the clean, controlled way of a man who trained not for vanity, but because discipline had become part of his bones. His face was sharply American in its masculinity. Angular cheekbones, a strong jaw, a chin cut like stone, clean-shaven with no softness except what sorrow had pressed into the lines around his eyes. His hair, dark once, was now touched with gray at the temples, cropped into a neat undercut that never quite forgot military habit. He wore a fitted green camouflage long-sleeve uniform, the cloth close enough to his frame to show the strength beneath it without vanity. Even sitting behind the wheel, he gave the impression of someone who remained upright inside himself. He had been gone 11 months and 8 days. Long enough for seasons to move without him. Long enough for a man to begin believing the people he loved would keep waiting in exactly the same shape he had left them. On the passenger seat lay a paper sack from a bakery 2 towns back, still warm when he bought it at dawn. Apple bread for his mother. Cinnamon rolls she liked, but always claimed were too sweet for a woman her age, right before eating one anyway. He had planned the small things on the drive north: fix the back gutter, repaint the porch rail, take Miriam to the doctor for the arthritis she kept pretending was just weather, sit by the stove and listen to her talk about people he had never met and local troubles he had not earned the right to ignore. He had also planned to apologize, though he had not decided what words could hold the weight of a year. Their last phone call had lasted less than 4 minutes. He remembered that now with perfect clarity and hated himself for it. Her voice had been thin with static, gentle as ever. She had asked if he was eating enough. He had told her yes. She had said, "Don't worry about me, Eli." He had smiled into the dead air like a fool and answered, "I know you're fine, Mom." Then someone had called him away, and he had said he would ring again when things settled. Things never settled. They only moved. Brightwater's small market square came into view, and he slowed. At first he did not understand what he was seeing. His mind refused it. It tried to make the scene into strangers, into some other family's sorrow, into a shape that did not fit his life. An elderly woman stood near the edge of the square beside the produce stalls, wrapped in a thin beige coat that had once been respectable and now hung on her like an apology. She was small, smaller than he remembered his mother ever being, with silver hair pinned back poorly, wisps of it blown loose by the wind. Her hands were red with cold. In one of them she held a dented cardboard box with 2 bruised rolls and what looked like half a wrapped sandwich someone had tossed in pity, rather than kindness. At her side stood a German shepherd. Ranger, 5 years old, black and tan. Big-chested and powerfully built by nature, though now too lean, the thick winter coat around his shoulders dulled and roughened from neglect and cold. His ears stood upright, alert as blades. His amber-brown eyes, always too intelligent for comfort, moved between the woman and the people passing them. He stood half a step in front of her, Not begging, not whining, not broken. Guarding. As if the world had shoved everything else away from him, but not that duty. A man at one of the outdoor tables waved a hand sharply. "Take the dog somewhere else. He's scaring customers." A teenage cashier stacking crates muttered, "That old lady again," not with hatred, but with the exhausted cruelty of someone who had grown used to looking away. The woman lowered her head. Elias had seen blood on roads. He had seen bodies after fire. He had seen houses split open by war. But something inside him broke more cleanly at the sight of his mother standing in daylight while people made her smaller with their eyes. He did not remember opening the truck door. 1 second he was sitting behind the wheel, and the next his boots were on the pavement and the cold was cutting into his lungs like glass. Rage rose in him with such speed it frightened even him. Not the wild rage of youth. Worse, the adult kind, the kind that arrived silent and stayed. Ranger saw him first. The dog went utterly still. No barking, no desperate scrambling, no theatrical joy, just stillness, deep and electric, as if the animal's whole body had become one listening nerve. His eyes locked on Elias. For one suspended second, the square, the people, the lake, the sunlight, everything seemed to fall away. Then Ranger moved. He crossed the distance slowly, each step deliberate. When he reached Elias, he pressed his head once against the man's hand. Only once. A gesture so brief and restrained, it nearly destroyed him. Then Ranger turned and went back to stand beside Miriam, taking his place again as though saying, "Now you see. Now do something." Elias looked at his mother. "Mama." She flinched at the sound. Her face lifted slowly, as if shame itself had weight. Her skin was pale under the cold, and the fine bones of her face showed more sharply than they should have. There were deep hollows under her eyes. But they were still her eyes, light, tired, gentle, carrying the remains of a woman who had spent a lifetime making a home feel warmer than weather had any right to allow. For a second she didn't know him, or maybe she knew him and could not bear to. Then recognition came over her face, in a tremor rather than a spark. Her mouth moved, her chin shook, and the first words she gave him were not hello, not my son, not thank God. "I'm sorry," she whispered. "I couldn't keep the house." The bakery bag slipped from Elias's hand and landed softly on the ground. June Bell owned the diner just off the square, a narrow place with fogged windows and a bell above the door that jingled too brightly for the heaviness inside it. June was around 40, sturdy and warm-faced, with chestnut hair twisted into a hurried knot and flour dusting one sleeve of her rust-colored sweater. She had the kind of eyes that made room for hurt before questions, the kind of woman who looked like she belonged behind a counter, steadying a town 1 cup of coffee at a time. She had been slipping food to Miriam for weeks. Elias knew that before she said a word. You could see guilt in a decent person. It never hid well. "I've got the back room ready," June said quietly. "It's not much, but it's warm." He nodded, because if he tried to thank her just then, his voice would fail him. The room behind the diner had once been storage. Now it held a narrow cot, an old green chair, a wool blanket folded twice at the end, and a small space heater humming with stubborn effort. Miriam sat in the chair with both hands wrapped around a mug of broth June had made. Ranger lay at her feet at first, then rose and settled near the door instead, facing outward. Watching? Elias stood for a long time because sitting felt too much like surrender. At last Miriam began to speak, not smoothly, not with the dignity of a prepared story. The truth came out of her in worn fragments, like objects lifted one by one from cold water. Calder Thorne had started helping in the spring. A neighbor. Polite. Reliable? Too polite, Elias thought immediately. Miriam described him as tall and neat, always in dark coats, with carefully combed hair and the dry, civilized smile of a man who never raised his voice because he did not need to. He had offered to help her untangle back taxes and a roof repair permit. He had used phrases like temporary authorization and routine filing. He had brought papers when her hands were stiff and her eyes tired. One day he drove her outside town to sign documents, saying it would be faster than waiting at the county office. "I thought—" She stopped, fingers tightening around the cup. "I thought it was help." Elias knelt in front of her then, not touching yet, because some griefs could only bear witness first. She told him about signing where she was pointed, about not having her reading glasses, about feeling foggy from the pills Naomi Pierce had given her for pain, about trusting the voice beside her because it sounded practiced and calm. Not long after that, Calder returned with copies of transfer papers. He changed the locks while she was at the pharmacy. The power was cut within the week. A notice was nailed to the porch telling her she was no longer authorized to remain on the property. "She tried calling you," June said softly from the doorway. "More than once." Miriam shut her eyes. The phone went dead. Her voice was thin with humiliation. "I wrote letters. I asked at the post office. Nothing came back. And then—" She swallowed. Then it all felt too shameful to put into words. At that moment, Ranger rose sharply. His ears snapped forward. A low sound gathered in his chest, not a growl meant for attack, but one meant for warning. He crossed the room and pressed his nose hard against the bottom of Miriam's coat, then turned toward Elias and pawed once at the floorboards near the chair. Once, then again. Elias frowned, crouched, and looked. Caught beneath the chair leg was a crumpled envelope, worn soft at the edges from being folded and unfolded too many times. It had never been mailed. On the front, in Miriam's trembling but careful handwriting, was his name. Not Lieutenant, not Mr. Vance, not some formal distance created by fear or pride. Just Eli. When he opened it, a loose page slid halfway out. He saw only the first line before his throat closed. "If this reaches you, don't be angry with Ranger." He tried to stop it. He did not read farther. Not then. He could not. Ranger came back and sat beside him, not looking at the letter, only at Miriam, as if the dog knew memory had claws and should be handled gently. Evening closed slowly over Brightwater. The diner quieted. June locked the front door and left a lamp on for them. Miriam fell asleep in the chair at last, exhaustion taking her in soft stages. She looked older in sleep, but also more peaceful, as if unconsciousness allowed her to rest from dignity for a while. Elias stepped out the back door into the bitter air. The town had gone silver blue beneath the moon. Beyond the clustered roofs and dark trees, he could see a faint rise overlooking the lake, where the old house stood. His house once, then his mother's, then something sacred, simply because she had remained inside it after his father died. Even from this distance he could pick out the slope of the roof and the porch line, a pale shape under moonlight. Too far, too still, like a place stolen from the living and set down among the dead. Ranger came out after him and settled against his boot. For a while, neither of them moved. Elias thought of the letter in his pocket, of his mother holding shame alone because his absence had taught her it was safer than burdening him, of Calder Thorne speaking gently while building a trap out of paper, of all the ways violence could be done without ever lifting a hand. He had spent half his life being trained to recognize enemy patterns. Now he recognized one. He looked toward the house again and felt something cold and exact align inside him. This was no misunderstanding, no unfortunate technicality, no neighborly confusion that could be cleared with polite conversation and patience. Somebody had studied his mother's loneliness, her age, her trust, her pride, and used them like tools. Somebody had taken the place where she belonged and made her beg in sight of it. He bent down and rested a hand on Ranger's neck. The dog's fur was rougher than it should have been, thinner along the ribs. Elias felt the heat beneath it and the quiet tremor of long-held strain. "You stayed," he said. Ranger leaned just slightly. The moon hung over the lake like a witness too old to lie. Inside, his mother slept in a borrowed room. Outside, the house waited in the dark. And Elias Vance made a promise without speaking it aloud. He would not merely take back what Calder Thorne had stolen. He would uncover, piece by piece, the method, the pressure, the silence, the ugliness dressed as legality. He would drag the truth into daylight so hard and so fully that no one in Brightwater would ever again be allowed to say they hadn't seen what had been done to Miriam Vance. The sky remained bright even in winter, but now he understood. Some light did not comfort, some light exposed. Morning came pale and hard over Brightwater. The diner windows had fogged from the warmth inside, but outside the world looked cut from tin and glass. Frost silvered the parked trucks along Main Street. The lake beyond town held the sky in a cold blue sheet, so still it looked less like water than a held breath. Elias Vance had slept little. He had spent most of the night in the backroom chair with his elbows on his knees, listening to the heater click and Miriam's uneven breathing settle, then catch, then settle again. Ranger had remained awake longer than both of them, head lifted, ears turning at every sound from the alley, as if even safety had to be watched before it could be trusted. By dawn, Elias had already begun building order out of pain. That was how he survived anything, not by softening it, by naming it, timing it, breaking it into parts small enough to grip. He borrowed a yellow legal pad from June Bell and drew a line down the center of the first page. On one side, he wrote dates. On the other, events, names, places, details. Roof repair bill, tax notice, pharmacy pickup, Calder visit, paper signing, lock changed, utilities cut, notice posted. He wrote carefully, the way some men loaded a rifle, precisely with no wasted motion. June set a cup of coffee beside him without comment. In daylight she looked older than she had the night before, not from age, but from responsibility. She was a broad-shouldered woman in her early 40s, with strong wrists, a flour-smudged apron, and chestnut hair pinned up carelessly, as though the morning always arrived before she was ready. Her face was open, warm, and a little worn around the eyes. She was the kind of woman people leaned on before they noticed they were doing it. "Some folks knew pieces," she said quietly. "Not enough to help right. Or maybe enough, and they got scared." Elias looked up. "Scared of what?" June glanced toward the front counter, though the diner was empty. "Calder doesn't shout. That's what makes him worse. He smiles and says things in a tone that makes decent people feel foolish for doubting him." She dried her hands on her apron and leaned a hip against the table. "He's been buying around the lake for years. Cottages, old lots, anything with shoreline or access paths. Says he's improving the town, bringing business. But he doesn't want houses. He wants connected land." Elias let that settle. His mother's house sat on a bend above the water where a strip of legal access ran down between birch trees to the lake. His father had always called that strip the spine of the place. Without it, the surrounding properties lost value. With it, someone could join parcels and reshape the whole shoreline. "You think that's why he wanted hers?" June gave him a tired look. "I think men don't spend 2 years being nice to a widow unless they want something that won't fit in a pie box." That almost made him smile. Almost? Miriam woke slowly that morning, stiff with cold and sleep. In daylight, Elias could see more clearly what the last year had taken from her. She had always been a small woman, but not fragile. Once there had been a briskness to her, a neat little current of energy that moved through a room before she did. Now she seemed reduced by careful humiliations. Not broken, reduced. There was a difference, and he hated that he knew it. Her silver hair had been brushed back by June, and she wore a clean cardigan someone had found for her, but her hand still trembled faintly as she took the tea Elias made. Ranger came to her at once, pressing his shoulder against her shin until she rested a hand on his neck. Only then did he lie down. Even thin and roughened by hardship, he still looked magnificent in the way working dogs do, black saddle across his back, tan along the legs and chest, ears upright, amber eyes too aware. He did not fidget. He watched. Elias asked Miriam for details gently now, not like a son demanding justice all at once, but like a man assembling a bridge over ice. She told him about the first roof leak in spring, then a second. About county envelopes arriving with numbers she did not fully understand. About Calder Thorne offering rides into town when her joints were bad. About how useful he made himself, changing a porch bulb, carrying feed, bringing over forms already clipped to neat packets. He always spoke as if things were urgent, Miriam said. Not angry urgent, paper urgent. That kind is harder to argue with. Elias wrote that down. By 10 o'clock, he drove to Dr. Naomi Pierce's clinic on the north side of town. Ranger came with him. Dr. Pierce was in her early 40s, lean and self-contained, with dark brown hair tied low at the nape and clear gray eyes behind narrow glasses. Her white coat hung straight over a charcoal sweater, and her voice carried the calm of someone who had spent years standing between fear and information. She was not sentimental, which made Elias trust her more. When he explained who he was and why he had come, something in her face softened, not with pity, but with recognition. "Your mother should have had support," she said. "She didn't?" Naomi reviewed Miriam's chart with brisk fingers. Anti-inflammatory medication, sleep aid for intermittent insomnia, a stronger pain prescription on the week in question because Miriam had strained herself lifting wood too early in the season. None of this would make her unconscious, Naomi said, but in an elderly patient taken together, especially if she hadn't eaten enough, it could absolutely slow processing, make dense paperwork harder to follow, increase suggestibility under pressure. Suggestibility, Elias repeated, disliking the word because it sounded too soft for what had been done. Naomi met his eyes directly. "You're hearing weakness in it. I'm describing vulnerability. They're not the same thing." That landed in him. She printed the dates of the prescriptions and circled the refill pickup with a firm stroke of her pen. If someone wanted her compliant without looking violent, timing mattered. On the drive back, Elias took the long road past the lake instead of the main street. It cost him more than he expected. The house came into view between the birches, its roofline familiar enough to hurt. The place sat exactly where memory had left it, white trim, weathered cedar siding, porch facing the water. But memory had not prepared him for the signs of occupation without love. The curtains had changed. A side gate leaned half open. There was a chain across the drive, too new and too clean. Houses knew who belonged to them. This one looked like it was trying not to show its confusion. Ranger rose in the truck seat with a low, rising rumble in his chest. "Easy," Elias murmured. But Ranger did not look at the house. He stared past it, toward the detached garage at the rear. The dog's back lifted slightly, hackles sharp beneath the fur. Not random alarm. Recognition. Elias slowed, but kept driving. Not yet, he thought. He had spent too many years learning the cost of moving before the ground was known. At noon, he met Owen Bell at the county records annex 2 towns over. Owen, June's older brother, was 60 if he was a day, tall and spare as a fence post, with iron-gray hair combed cleanly back and a narrow face sharpened by long habit and longer disappointment. He wore a wool coat the color of wet stone, a plain shirt, and thin-rimmed glasses that made him look even more exacting than he was. Years in land records had left him with the temperament of a man who believed paper could ruin lives as efficiently as bullets, just more politely. He took the photocopies Elias had managed to gather and stood under the fluorescent light, turning pages in silence. Ranger lay by the office door, still as carved wood, though his ears flicked whenever footsteps passed in the hall. Owen finally tapped the stack with one finger. "Too thick," Elias frowned. For what? For what she believed she was signing? Owen adjusted his glasses. A limited authorization packet should not require this much supporting language unless it folds into something broader. Transfer preparation, trust realignment, title contingency, lien handling. See here? He pointed to a cramped section halfway down a page where the formatting changed slightly. This paragraph references rights your mother had no reason to surrender if the purpose was only tax or permit assistance. He flipped 2 more pages. And this notary block, sloppy, missing an identifier, not illegal on its face, but wrong enough to irritate me. That, from Owen Bell, sounded nearly profane. Then he stopped on the signature page. The date here is the same date Naomi says she refilled medication? Elias nodded. Owen exhaled through his nose. Then this is not a simple case of an older woman being careless. This is a man creating a paper trail around her before she understood she was standing inside it. When they stepped outside the annex, a wind had come up across the parking lot, carrying the smell of wet leaves and exhaust. Elias was about to open the truck door when Ranger froze beside him, not growling this time, listening. Across the lot, half hidden behind a row of municipal vehicles, stood a woman in a pale blue coat with a clipboard held against her chest. She was middle-aged, slight, with short blonde-gray hair and the posture of someone trying to make herself smaller than her conscience. Her face was turned toward them, and though she looked away the instant Elias noticed her, he had seen enough. The startled guilt, the too-quick retreat, the expression of someone who recognized danger not because she feared violence, but because she feared being remembered. Ranger took one step forward and stopped. Owen watched the woman disappear around the corner of the building. "You know her?" "No," Elias said, but the dog's fixed stare told him one thing with absolute certainty. Ranger did. By late afternoon, Brightwater had gone dim under a sheet of pearl-gray cloud. Elias left Ranger with June and walked alone to Calder Thorne's office near the marina, a renovated real estate storefront with expensive blinds and a brass plaque that made theft look respectable. Calder himself opened the door. He was a handsome man in the way certain predators were handsome, tall, controlled, silver beginning at the temples, dark coat fitted cleanly over a narrow frame, face long and composed, mouth shaped into permanent civility. No beard, no looseness anywhere. His eyes were pale and dry, and they rested on Elias with the smooth calm of a man who preferred to rearrange other people before they ever noticed his hands on them. "Mr. Vance," Calder said, "I heard you were back." Elias stood square in the doorway, shoulders broad enough to make the space feel smaller. "Then you know why I'm here." Calder gave a soft sigh, as if burdened by another man's emotion. "Your mother's situation is unfortunate, but the transfer was legal. I made every effort to keep matters orderly." "Orderly?" Elias repeated. "Yes?" Calder folded his hands lightly. "I understand grief makes people suspicious, especially when they return late to a situation they might have altered earlier. There it was. Elegant cruelty. No raised voice, no crude accusation. Just a knife slid between the ribs with a lawyer's smile. "If you'd been here sooner," Calder added, "perhaps things would indeed have gone differently." The words hit harder because Elias already believed part of them. For one dangerous second, he imagined crossing the room and putting the man through the polished wall behind him. Instead, he let the silence lengthen until Calder's pleasant expression tightened by a fraction. Then Elias said, very quietly, "You should have taken the house from someone who had no one to come back for her." Something unreadable passed through Calder's eyes. Not fear. Calculation. For the first time, Elias saw the man revise him. When he walked back into the cold, the town looked unchanged. That was the offense of evil dressed in paperwork. The sky stayed blue, boats stayed tied, people kept buying groceries. But something had changed inside him. He was no longer standing in the raw shock of what had happened. Shock had edges too wild to use. This was different. This was focus. June's diner glowed amber by the time he returned. Miriam sat at the back table wrapped in a shawl, one hand resting in Ranger's fur. The dog lifted his head as Elias entered and searched his face in a single glance, not asking whether they were safe, asking whether there was now a direction. Elias took off his coat slowly, sat across from his mother, and placed the legal pad on the table between them. "Tomorrow," he said, his voice steady at last, "we start proving every step." Miriam looked at the page, then at him, and for the first time since his return, some small light of old faith came back into her face. Outside, evening lowered itself over Brightwater, and the lake went dark. Inside, black ink and white paper were beginning to lose their power. Brightwater looked gentler in the morning than it deserved. A thin gold light lay over the lake, turning the water into beaten metal and softening the worn edges of the town. From a distance, the place still carried the charm of old postcards, a white church steeple, a bakery with blue-painted trim, a row of storefronts with hand-lettered signs, pines standing behind them like a green wall against winter. It was the kind of town people imagined as safe because the streets were small enough for everyone to know everyone's name. Elias Vance had learned long ago that small places did not always make kindness easier. Sometimes they made silence easier. He left the diner just after sunrise with Ranger at his side and a folded sheet of notes in his coat pocket. Miriam was still asleep in the back room, curled beneath 2 blankets June had found for her. In sleep, she looked younger in some painful way, as if suffering had only rearranged her face and not yet touched the person beneath it. Elias stood in the doorway a moment before leaving, watching the slow rise and fall of her shoulders. Then he stepped out into the brittle cold with the kind of purpose that kept a man upright when grief wanted him bent. Ranger moved in silence beside him, a large German shepherd with a black saddle across his back and tan legs built like carved wood. He had lost weight over the past months, but not presence. Nothing about him begged. His ears remained upright, his eyes bright amber and searching, his stride measured. He walked like a creature who had learned hunger without surrendering dignity. Their first stop was the bakery. The bell over the door rang as they entered, and the smell of yeast and cinnamon wrapped around them. Behind the counter stood a woman in her 50s with a rounded face, pale skin, and iron-gray curls pinned loosely beneath a scarf. Her name tag read, Marlene Pike. She was the sort of woman whose features had once been soft and cheerful but had sharpened into caution over the years. Her mouth seemed made for smiling and withholding at the same time. When Elias asked whether she remembered seeing Miriam in the past months, Marlene's hands paused on a tray of rolls. "I remember lots of things," she said, not unkindly. "That doesn't always mean I'm eager to repeat them." Elias did not move closer. He knew better than to crowd fear. "I'm not asking you to invent anything, only to tell me what's already true." Marlene looked at Ranger, then at the street outside, as if checking whether the town itself might overhear. At last she lowered her voice. "Your mother came in more than once near closing," she said. "Never begging. That part matters. She'd ask if there was work left. Sweeping, wiping tables, hauling flour bags she had no business trying to lift." A faint bitterness touched her tone. The girl couldn't have lifted a sack of feathers by then, but pride still made her ask. Elias listened without writing anything down yet. Some things deserved to be heard before they were recorded. "She cried here once," Marlene said after a pause. "Only once, not loudly. Just stood by the window with that dog beside her and cried like she was trying not to disturb the bread." What happened before that? Marlene hesitated. Calder had been in that morning, talking to Ted from the hardware store. Said something about your mother losing her memory. Said it kindly, too. That's what made it spread. Elias nodded once. A lie delivered harshly made enemies. A lie delivered gently made witnesses doubt themselves. From the bakery he went to the old post office annex, a squat brick building at the far end of Main Street. Most official mailing had moved online or out of town, and the place felt half abandoned even while functioning. The clerk on duty was a narrow man in his 60s named Harlan Vick, with a nicotine-yellow mustache and hands stained by ink. He wore a brown cardigan buttoned wrong at the top, and his voice had the dry scrape of someone who lived among paper and preferred it to people. At first, Harlan answered every question as if it were a bureaucratic inconvenience. No, he did not track private mail. No, he did not recall specific envelopes. No, he was not accusing anyone of interference. Then Ranger walked slowly to the side door, where returned mail bins were stacked. The dog did not scratch or bark. He simply sat beside the bins and stared at them with such focused stillness that Harlan's face changed. "What?" Elias asked quietly. The clerk rubbed a thumb along the edge of the counter. "There were letters," he admitted. "Handwritten, addressed out of state. Same writing each time. Your mother's, I suppose." He glanced away. A few came back marked incomplete routing. One disappeared before being logged as returned. "Disappeared how?" Harlan's jaw tightened. "You know how towns work. Somebody says they're helping an elderly woman keep her affairs in order, and another somebody stops asking what help means." Elias felt the cold rise in him again. Not a fire. An older thing. A glacier moving. He thanked the man and left. The church sat on a low rise near the lake road, white clapboard with narrow stained windows that held more blue than red. Inside it smelled of polished wood and old hymnals. Reverend Paul Hales met him near the front pews. He was in his late 50s, tall, thin, and slightly stooped, with a long, kind face and a fringe of silver hair around a bald crown. His hands were those of a man who had spent years lifting soup pots and coffins with equal care. When Elias asked whether Miriam had ever come there, the Reverend's expression darkened with regret. "She stayed one night in the fellowship room," he said. "Only one. I offered longer. She refused." "Why?" "Because she still believed displacement was temporary," Paul said. "And because shame convinces decent people they are imposing even when they are the injured ones." He led Elias to a small side room with a folded cot against the wall. "Ranger slept on the floor by the door," he said. "Never once lay down fully. Kept his head up all night. I've seen frightened dogs. That one wasn't frightened. He was waiting." The sentence stayed with Elias longer than it should have. Rehook. By early afternoon, Ranger changed direction on his own. They had just left the hardware store when the dog slowed, lifted his head, and turned toward a narrow service lane behind the shuttered feed supply warehouse at the edge of town. There was no tension in the leashless line of his body, no alarm, only certainty. Elias followed. The warehouse stood half-forgotten behind tangles of dead vines and a leaning fence. Its side door hung crooked. Inside, the air was cold enough to sting the lungs. Light came through high dirty windows in pale bars. Ranger crossed the room straight to the back corner where a stack of broken pallets hid a small hollow between the wall and an old workbench. There, Elias found a folded wool scarf he recognized immediately. Miriam's, the soft blue one she wore in late autumn. Beneath it lay an empty pill bottle with Naomi Pierce's label, a cracked thermos cap, and a small spiral notebook swollen from damp. His fingers tightened as he opened it. The writing inside was shaky but disciplined, every line pressed into order by habit. Miriam had not recorded thoughts. She had recorded facts. April 18th. Calder said roof estimate $4,900 April 22nd. Tax paper says $2,100. Asked later May 3rd, Lydia/Gray Car/ signed outside town. May 3rd, forgot glasses. May 4th, call Eli again. Elias closed his eyes. For a moment, the entire warehouse seemed to tilt. His mother had been fighting back in the only way left to her, not loudly, not successfully, but methodically, stubbornly, with the same small domestic discipline she had once used to label jam jars and keep receipts in tidy envelopes. Even pushed out of her own home, even worn down to hunger, she had still been trying to leave a trail. Ranger nudged Elias's wrist once, softly. The gesture nearly undid him. He exhaled and stood. "Good work," he murmured. The words were meant for the dog, but they belonged to his mother too. That afternoon he took the notebook to Sheriff Daniel Hart. Hart's office sat beside the municipal building, a low cinder-block structure that smelled faintly of coffee, dust, and old winter coats. The sheriff himself was a large man in his mid-50s with a weathered face, a trimmed brown-gray mustache, and the heavy posture of someone who had spent too many years in a chair built for urgency. He wore his uniform properly, but without pride, as though it had become another tool rather than an identity. Daniel Hart was not a cruel man. Elias saw that almost immediately, and it made him more difficult to hate. Hart read the notebook in silence, then set it down carefully. "This is something," he said, "but not enough." Elias remained standing. Not enough for what? For criminal fraud on its own, for immediate seizure, for me to walk onto Calder Thorne's property and drag him out in cuffs. Hart folded his hands. Right now, this still reads like a civil property dispute with troubling circumstances. "Troubling circumstances?" Elias repeated. "My mother lost her house, her utilities, half her body weight, and the town decided it was paperwork." Hart's face tightened, but he did not rise to the anger. "You think I don't know how bad it looks?" Do you?" A long silence followed. At last the sheriff stood. He was broader than Elias had realized, with tired eyes that belonged to a man who had spent years choosing the least damaging option and calling it duty. "Calder keeps everything layered," Hart said quietly. "He doesn't threaten in public, doesn't bruise anybody. He uses contracts, deadlines, signatures, third-party filings. Men like that count on two things: fear and fatigue. They wear people down until the truth looks too expensive." Elias studied him. "And what do you count on?" Hart gave him a bleak, humorless look. "Most days, a small enough town that trouble stays ordinary." There it was, not betrayal, cowardice diluted by routine. When Elias left the office, the winter light was already draining from the street. He felt no satisfaction, only a sharper understanding of the shape of the fight. Systems did not need to be evil to fail the vulnerable. They only needed to be tired. He returned to June's diner after dark with the notebook in his pocket and the weariness of a man who had spent the whole day hearing what people almost did. June was closing up. She looked at his face once and handed him a bowl of stew without asking questions. Miriam had fallen asleep at the back table instead of the cot, one hand curved under her cheek like a child's. Ranger lay stretched across the threshold of the room, not asleep, just still, guarding the line between refuge and the rest of the world. Elias sat down with the notebook open in front of him and meant only to rest his eyes for a minute. When he woke, it was to the touch of Miriam's hand on his shoulder. Dawn had not come yet, but the dark had softened. The heater clicked. Somewhere in the kitchen, a pipe thudded once in the wall. Elias straightened too quickly, disoriented, then saw her standing beside him in her borrowed shawl, small and silver-haired in the weak light. Ranger remained at the door, head lifted. Miriam looked from the stack of papers to her son's face. Something quiet and tender moved through her expression, not relief exactly, but recognition. "When you were little," she said, her voice no more than a thread, "I used to look out at storms and know you'd come back through them." Elias could not answer. Her fingers rested lightly against his shoulder, warm and frail at once. "This time," she said, glancing toward Ranger, "I think he knew it too." No miracle followed, no sudden answer, no heavenly sign written into the windows. Only that small room, the sleeping town, the dog at the threshold, a mother who had suffered more than she could name, a son bent over papers, finally where he should have been. Sometimes faith did not arrive as certainty. Sometimes it arrived as somebody still waiting for you when the world had already decided not to. The next morning arrived with a thin white frost over Brightwater, and a silence that felt almost ceremonial, as if the town itself knew something had shifted and was pretending not to notice. Elias Vance stood outside June Bell's diner with his hands in the pockets of his camouflage jacket, watching the first light gather over the lake. The water lay pale and still beyond the town, framed by pines and bare birches. It was beautiful in the stubborn northern way that made suffering feel almost indecent, as if sorrow ought to ask permission before stepping into such clean air. He had slept less than 2 hours, not because he was tired in the ordinary sense, but because his mind had stopped behaving like a mind and started behaving like a map. Details kept pinning themselves into place. Dates, names, the smell of damp wool in the warehouse, Miriam's thin handwriting, the way Sheriff Hart had looked like a man already apologizing to his conscience for not doing more. Ranger stood beside him, his black and tan coat rougher than it should have been, but his posture unwavering. The German shepherd was 5 years old and large-framed, broad through the chest, with upright ears and amber eyes that missed nothing. Hunger had thinned him. Hard weather had dulled the shine of his fur. But none of that had diminished the intelligence in his face. He was not restless. He was ready. June stepped out carrying a paper bag and a folded list. "I wrote down the address Owen found," she said. "Lydia Hargrove. Lives outside Danner's Ridge now. Used to work mobile notary jobs for folks who couldn't travel easy." June looked tired this morning. The warmth in her face was still there, but something sharper had settled behind it. Fear, perhaps? or the beginning of courage, which often looked like fear that had simply run out of places to hide. "She may not talk," June added. Elias took the list. "She's going to see me either way." June glanced at Ranger and managed a faint smile. "I think she's more likely to see him first." Danner's Ridge sat 25 minutes east of Brightwater, where the roads narrowed and the pines pressed close enough to darken the shoulders of the highway. Lydia Hargrove's house stood at the end of a gravel lane lined with mailboxes that leaned like tired men. It was a pale green bungalow with a rusted metal awning and a gray sedan parked beneath a carport. The place looked neat from a distance and nervous up close. Owen Bell was already waiting when Elias arrived. Owen stood beside his truck with a folder tucked under one arm, tall and spare in his dark wool coat, his iron-gray hair combed back from a long, severe face. He looked like a man who had spent his life trusting order because disorder had once cost him too much. Elias had the impression Owen had not always been this closed. Perhaps years in county records had done it to him, or perhaps grief had. Some men carried loss in their shoulders. Owen carried his in the way he folded paper. "She's home," Owen said quietly. Curtain moved twice. Elias nodded and walked up the front path. Lydia Hargrove opened the door before he knocked. She was in her late 50s, thin to the point of appearing breakable, with short blonde gray hair cut unevenly around the ears and a face that might once have been elegant if worry had not pulled it tight. Her skin was pale, almost translucent around the temples. She wore a slate-colored cardigan and held herself with the brittle caution of someone who had spent years avoiding direct collisions by stepping aside before anyone reached her. "Yes?" Her voice carried the defensive politeness of a person who already knew the conversation and wished to deny it room to begin. "My name is Elias Vance," he said. "This is Owen Bell. We need to ask you about Miriam Vance." The name changed her, only slightly. A tightening at the corners of the mouth, a flicker in the eyes. But Elias had seen lesser tells on more dangerous faces. "I notarized dozens of documents," Lydia said. "I don't keep private recollections of people's business." Owen's gaze remained steady. "You might want to keep a recollection of this one." She started to answer, but Ranger stepped forward. Not aggressively. He did not bare his teeth or bark. He moved to the edge of the porch and stood between Elias and the steps leading back toward the carport. His eyes fixed not on Lydia, but on the gray sedan, more specifically, on the trunk. Lydia noticed. So did Elias. For the first time, her composure frayed. The dog's posture was enough. Something in that car carried a memory. Old paper, old fabric, Miriam's scent from the day of the signing, perhaps. Nothing supernatural. Just the kind of physical truth animals found before people admitted it existed. Lydia's hand tightened around the doorframe. "I followed instructions," she said too quickly. "That's all." "There it is," Owen murmured. Elias let the silence draw out, and Lydia filled it the way guilty people often did. "It was not illegal," she said. "Unusual, maybe, but not illegal." "What was unusual?" Elias asked. She swallowed. The morning wind stirred the dead grass around the porch. Somewhere down the road a dog barked once and went quiet. "It wasn't done at her home," Lydia said. "That's all I'll say." Elias held her gaze. "Where?" Lydia looked past him, toward the trees, as if the answer might be hanging there instead of inside her. "A parking lot beside a title office in Mercer's Run. The office had closed early that day. Mr. Thorne said it was more convenient to meet outside than reschedule." Owen's jaw set hard. Mercer's Run was a smaller town beyond county lines, close enough to reach in under an hour, far enough to avoid familiar eyes. "You notarized a document for an elderly woman," Owen said, "in a parking lot, outside a closed office, away from her home county?" Lydia's face colored with shame and resistance at once. "He told me she preferred privacy." "And you believed him?" Elias asked. "I believed," Lydia snapped, then faltered. "I believed I was not being paid to interrogate family arrangements." The word family landed in the cold air like something spoiled. Miriam had not been treated like family. She had been processed. Lydia folded in on herself a little after that. She would not admit more, but she had already admitted enough to tear a seam in Calder's version of events. When they left, Elias did not look triumphant. He looked colder. "Parking lot, closed office, another county," Owen said once they reached the trucks. "If this ever gets in front of a judge, that will smell wrong before anyone even opens the file." "It still won't be enough," Elias said. "No," Owen replied, "but it's a start." Claire Sutton arrived that afternoon. June had sent word to a legal aid contact she knew through a church fundraiser from years back, and Claire came in just before dusk, carrying a leather satchel and the expression of a woman already expecting to disappoint somebody. She was in her mid-30s, slim, composed, with dark brown hair drawn into a low knot and sharp, intelligent features that would have looked severe if not for the fatigue in her eyes. She wore a charcoal turtleneck beneath a fitted green coat, dark slacks, and boots polished more by weather than vanity. Everything about her seemed efficient, including her sympathy. She shook Elias's hand firmly, greeted Miriam with quiet respect, and sat down at the diner table as if entering a deposition. "Before anyone asks," Claire said, laying out papers, "I'm not here to promise victory. I'm here to tell you whether the law has a path, and if it does, whether that path is worth the cost." Elias almost disliked her instantly. Then she began reading. She moved through the photocopied transfer forms, Naomi Pierce's notes, Owen's observations, and Miriam's recovered records with clean, unhurried attention. She did not interrupt for drama. She interrupted for precision. When she signed, did she have her reading glasses? Miriam, sitting in June's spare cardigan with both hands around a mug of tea, frowned in thought. "No, I'd left them on the kitchen counter. Calder said it was only one page." Claire looked down at the stack. It was not one page. "No," Miriam whispered. "Did anyone read the material aloud to you?" "Not properly." "Did Mr. Thorne explain that ownership could transfer?" Miriam's mouth trembled. "He said it would protect the house." Claire leaned back slightly. There it was, the first true line of legal daylight. Ranger, who had been lying near the stove, suddenly rose and crossed the room to Miriam. He did not nuzzle her this time. He placed his head in her lap and went completely still. Miriam's hand, almost without thought, moved to the fur behind his ears. The gesture changed her. Something in her face loosened. Not weakness, clarity. "The car smelled like wet wood," she said softly, looking not at Claire, but somewhere beyond the room. "And stale smoke. I remember that now. And Calder kept saying, 'Just sign, Miriam. This keeps the state from touching the deed.'" Claire's eyes sharpened at once. "He mentioned the deed specifically?" Miriam nodded, breathing a little faster. "Yes, but he said it as though he was saving it, not taking it." The room went quiet. It was a small thing, maybe, to anyone outside it, a fragment of remembered language. But lies often lived in their verbs. Save, protect, hold. Men like Calder did not snatch trust. They redirected it. Claire closed the folder. "This matters," she said. An elderly woman, medicated, without glasses, taken out of county to sign a multi-page property instrument that was not read aloud or accurately explained. That is not a clerical misunderstanding. That is exploitation wearing formal shoes. For the first time since Claire had arrived, Elias saw something warmer than professionalism in her expression. Not optimism. Anger. That night, after Miriam had been persuaded to sleep, Elias drove with Ranger to the lake road. He had no intention of crossing into the house or breaking anything that would stain the truth with desperation. He only wanted to see it again with the new knowledge inside him, to stand near it and understand what Calder believed he had taken. Moonlight lay across the old property in silver plains. The house looked both familiar and estranged. Not dead, occupied incorrectly. Elias remained near the roadside shoulder, hands in his pockets. Ranger moved farther than usual, circling the outer edge of the yard, nose low, then returning toward the back porch. He paused beside the rear steps and pawed once at the baseboard beneath the lowest tread. Elias crouched. There was a narrow gap beneath the wood, almost invisible unless you knew where to look. He reached in and felt cold plastic. The bag came free with dirt clinging to it. Inside were folded papers protected in an old waterproof sleeve, original tax receipts in Miriam's name, a handwritten page comparing the numbers Calder had quoted her against the actual county balance, and an unsigned draft of a statement she had apparently meant to bring somewhere official. Not polished, not legal language, just Miriam's clear, stubborn accounting in her own hand. He read enough to understand one thing immediately. Calder had inflated the urgency, inflated the debt, and built fear before he built the transfer. This was no longer just suspicion. It was architecture. A car passed on the far road then, headlights sweeping briefly over the trees. Elias tucked the papers away and stood. He had the sudden, unmistakable sense of being watched, not by chance, but by design. He and Ranger left without a sound. The threat came the next afternoon, not to him. To June. A man from the county health office appeared at the diner with a clipboard and a smile too practiced to be innocent. He was young, red-faced from cold, clearly uncomfortable in his own role. He mentioned permit updates, food safety compliance, possible review of back storage conditions. He never raised his voice. He never said Calder's name. He did not have to. When he left, June stood for a long time at the window, arms folded tightly across herself. "I knew this part would come," she said. Elias felt the weight of the recovered documents in his coat pocket. Claire's marked-up notes lay on the counter. Ranger watched the front door with his ears angled forward. The fight had changed shape. It was no longer only about proving what had been done to Miriam. It was about how far Calder would reach to keep the town obedient. Elias looked at June, then toward the back room where his mother slept, then at the darkening street beyond the glass. A first crack had opened in Calder's wall. Not enough to bring it down, but enough for light to get in. The week turned colder, but the back room of June Bell's diner began, slowly, to feel less like a hiding place and more like a small borrowed shore where broken things could be laid down without shame. Morning light came through the narrow window in pale strips, touching the old green chair, the folded blankets, the chipped table Claire Sutton had turned into a battlefield of files. Outside, Brightwater moved through its ordinary rituals. Delivery trucks, boots on pavement, church bells carried faintly over the lake. But inside that room, time no longer belonged to the town. It belonged to memory, to patience, to the stubborn work of putting truth back into order. Claire arrived every afternoon just before the lunch crowd thinned. She came in with her dark hair pinned low and her satchel full of folders, wearing the same efficient calm that had first made Elias distrust her and now made him rely on her. She was still lean, still sharp-eyed, still too honest to offer comfort before she believed it could survive contact with reality. But there was something more human in her now, less distance, more investment. She did not speak softly to Miriam because she pitied her. She spoke carefully because she respected what it cost an injured person to remember aloud. "We're not trying to tell the whole story at once," Claire said on the first day she sat Miriam down properly. "Only the true parts you can stand on, one piece at a time." Miriam nodded. She looked frailer in daylight than she had in the old photographs Elias kept in his wallet, but something of her former order had begun returning. June had found her a better sweater, a soft gray one that made her silver hair seem almost luminous when the sun struck it. Her hands still trembled when she was tired, and grief had hollowed the delicate lines of her face, but her eyes were steadier now. Not healed, steadier. There was a difference. Ranger lay beneath her chair while Claire asked questions. That had become his place during these conversations. The German shepherd would stretch his long black and tan body across the floorboards, one ear angled toward the room, one toward the door, always keeping watch on both the inner and outer danger. Whenever Miriam paused too long, her hand would drift down into the fur at his neck. Somehow that let her continue. The memories did not return in dramatic flashes. They came the way thaw moved over frozen ground, slowly, unevenly, in hidden places first. Miriam remembered the first pie Calder had brought over in early spring, still warm, apple and cinnamon, set on her counter with such studied thoughtfulness that she had felt rude not trusting him. She remembered him saying, with that polished concern of his, "People your age shouldn't be burdened with county language. Let someone younger carry the paper for you." She remembered nodding once when she did not fully understand, not because she agreed, but because she was embarrassed by how long it took her to sort the words in front of another person. That part wounded Elias more than the legal details. It was one thing to picture fraud in abstract lines and forged advantage. It was another to understand that his mother had been trapped not only by documents, but by the ancient ordinary shame of aging in front of a confident man. Claire wrote everything down. "Did he ever make you feel rushed?" she asked. Miriam gave a tired little smile with no humor in it. "He made me feel slow." Claire's pen paused. "That's even better for us," she said quietly. "A person being manipulated does not always feel threatened. Sometimes they feel ashamed. Courts understand that better than people think." Elias stood at the stove pretending to make coffee while he listened. He was good at stillness. He had built half his adult life out of it. But now and then, Claire's phrasing, or Miriam's voice, or the scrape of Ranger's claws on the floor when he shifted, would strike something in him so sharply that he had to grip the counter to remain where he was. That evening, after Claire left and June locked the front door, Miriam found him outside behind the diner, chopping wood for the stove. Snow had begun to gather in thin drifts along the fence. The sky above the lake was the color of tarnished silver. Elias swung the axe with controlled force, splitting logs cleanly, one after another, as though the rhythm itself might keep his thoughts from forming. Miriam stood under the back awning in her coat and watched him. "You don't have to work every feeling into splinters," she said gently. He let the axe head rest against the chopping block and looked at her. For a moment he was not 45. Not broad-shouldered, disciplined, difficult to break. He was just a son standing under winter light with too much unspoken inside him. "I kept believing you were fine because you always were," he said at last. "I built my whole life around that, around the idea that you could manage anything, that if something were truly wrong, I'd know." Miriam's face changed, not toward offense, not toward pain, but toward that quiet mercy mothers sometimes carried like second nature. "I taught you that," she said. "That was partly my fault, too." "No?" His voice came rougher than he intended. "I let strength become an excuse. I let your dignity do work it should never have had to do." She stepped closer, the cold catching in her breath. "Eli," she said softly, "I was lonely before I was desperate. Those are not the same thing. And loneliness makes people trust strange doors." He closed his eyes once. The worst part was not that she refused to blame him. It was that she was kind enough not to. The next day, June changed the front window. She did it at noon, in full view of Main Street, with the lunch customers still inside and the cold pressing white against the glass. She took down a faded pie special, wiped the inside pane clean, and hung a small hand-painted board in its place. No one in this town should go hungry or freeze after a lifetime of decency. The room fell still. Even the coffee machine seemed to hush around it. June stood beneath the sign with a red flush high in her cheeks, her chestnut hair escaping its knot, flour still dusting one sleeve. She looked terrified and immovable at once. For several long seconds, nobody spoke. Then an old man in a feed cap at the counter, one of the regulars who had spent 3 months pretending not to notice Miriam when she stood in the square, bowed his head, reached into his wallet, and left a folded bill under the sugar jar without saying a word. It was a small thing, but small things were how weather changed. After that, Brightwater began to loosen. Not all at once. Towns rarely repented in a straight line. But the silence that had protected Calder started to fray at the edges. Harlan Vick from the post office sent word through June that he remembered more now, enough to say, if needed, that at least one returned letter in Miriam's hand had vanished before it was logged properly. The pharmacist, Edwin Sloan, a narrow-shouldered man in his late 60s with thick glasses and a face worn kind by years behind a counter, admitted Calder had picked up Miriam's prescription once on the pretense of helping her. Edwin was not dramatic, not brave in any heroic sense, but he was exact. He kept records the way monks once kept scripture. If his ledger showed Calder collected the medication on a certain day, then that fact would not bend. At the gas station near the East Road, a mechanic named Toby Wren, young, freckled, and all elbows, with oil blackened into the lines of his hands, recognized Lydia Hargrove's Grace sedan from the description Claire provided. He remembered it because it had a dent above the rear wheel and because the elderly woman inside had looked like she was trying real hard to be agreeable while feeling sick. That description went through Elias like a nail. Claire gathered each of these statements with the same relentless care she used on contracts. "Paper matters," she said one evening, stacking fresh notes into neat piles. "But human patterns matter too, especially when they repeat. Especially when several people remember the same kind of discomfort around the same event." "And Lydia?" Elias asked. Claire looked up. "Lydia is the hinge," she said. They met Lydia Hargrove 2 days later in Claire's borrowed office space above the florist. The notary looked worse than before. Her cardigan hung looser on her shoulders, and the skin beneath her eyes had darkened into bruised half-moons. She sat with both hands wrapped around a paper cup of untouched tea, as if heat could excuse her from honesty. Claire did not push at first. She simply laid the known facts out in plain sequence. Miriam's age, the medication, the missing glasses, the out-of-town signing, the multi-page instrument, the failure to read the contents aloud. Lydia's mouth trembled. "I didn't think," she began, then stopped. "No," Claire said calmly. "You didn't." That, more than accusation, broke her. Lydia drew in a breath that seemed to hurt. "He told me the family had approved it. He said the son was away and wanted it handled quickly." The woman looked tired, but not incapable. Her voice frayed. "I saw she was confused. I knew she was confused, but I told myself confusion was not the same as refusal." Miriam sat very still through all of it. Ranger was at her feet, chin on his paws, eyes lifted toward Lydia with the grave attention of a creature who remembered what human beings wish to forget. "I should have stopped it," Lydia whispered. Claire's face did not soften. "Yes," she said, "you should have." Yet when Lydia finally signed the statement Claire prepared, her hand shook so violently that Miriam, who had every right to despise her, reached forward and steadied the edge of the paper. That was the kind of dignity Calder would never understand. He showed himself 3 evenings later, not at the diner, not at the house by the lake. He chose the alley behind the feed store, where the shadows came early and snow turned the ground pale enough to reflect moonlight. Elias had gone out alone to clear his head before bed. He heard the footsteps before he saw the man. Calder Thorne emerged from the darkness wearing a charcoal overcoat and leather gloves, his posture composed, his expression as civil as ever. But some of the polish had gone. His eyes were flatter now. His smile came slower, as though he had decided charm was no longer worth full effort. "This is becoming inconvenient," Calder said. Elias did not answer. Calder stopped a few feet away, close enough for Elias to smell cedar cologne and cold air on him. "You're making this uglier than it needs to be. Your mother can be provided for. A small house farther inland. Paid expenses. Quiet terms. Dignity preserved." "There's no dignity in a payoff," Elias said. "Not for you," Calder replied. "For her." That did it. Not the bribery, not the arrogance. The use of Miriam's dignity as bargaining language, as though the very thing he had stripped from her now belonged to him to redistribute. "What do you want?" Calder asked softly. Elias looked at him for a long time. "The truth," he said, "back where everyone can see it." For the first time, Calder's expression hardened openly. "You're mistaking principle for leverage. And you're mistaking decency for weakness." The silence between them was so cold it felt metallic. At last Calder gave a small nod, the kind men reserved for opponents they had stopped pretending to underestimate. Then he turned and walked away. Elias stood in the alley a while longer, breathing steam into the dark. When he returned to the diner, he did not wake Miriam. He found her seated by the back window anyway, a lamp burning low beside her. She was mending her old blue scarf stitch by stitch, the one recovered from the warehouse. Her silver hair was loose around her temples. Ranger slept at her feet, one paw stretched toward her chair. Outside, snow moved gently through the yard. Inside, Elias took off his coat, picked up the stack of split wood he had brought in, and set it beside the stove. No one spoke. There was no house around them that belonged to their name. No lock deed restored. No court order yet. No final victory. And yet, for the first time since his return, the room held something steadier than grief. Miriam by the window, repairing what could still be repaired. Ranger beneath her chair, keeping watch even in sleep. Elias at the stove, feeding warmth into borrowed walls. They had not gotten home, but they had found, for one quiet winter evening, the shape of family again. The county courthouse stood on a rise above the river road, its stone steps glazed with a thin skin of frost that made every footfall sound more careful than it was. Morning had come iron gray and bitter. The sky held no snow, only a hard, pale light that flattened the fields and made the bare trees look like ink strokes against frozen ground. It was the kind of cold that did not storm or dramatize. It simply remained, steady and impartial, the way old buildings remained while human lives were rearranged inside them. Elias Vance stood at the bottom of those steps with Miriam on one side and Ranger on the other. He had worn the same fitted green camouflage long-sleeve uniform he wore when he needed to feel himself assembled from the outside in. His shoulders were broad beneath it, his face clean-shaven and composed, his neatly kept dark hair touched with gray at the temples. He looked, to anyone watching, like a man too controlled to be shaken. Only the stillness in him gave away the strain. He was standing with the precision of someone holding a line inside his own chest. Miriam wore the gray sweater June had found for her beneath a darker coat and a knitted scarf folded twice at the throat. Her silver hair had been pinned back carefully that morning, not for vanity, but for dignity. That mattered. She was pale, and the cold made her seem smaller than she truly was, but her back was straight. Elias noticed that. He noticed everything now. Ranger did not belong in a courtroom, and yet seemed built to escort the truth to one. The German shepherd's coat had been brushed until the black and tan lay neat again, though he was still leaner than he should have been. His amber eyes were bright and watchful. He moved close to Miriam without crowding her, as if he understood the difference between guarding a body and protecting a spirit. Claire Sutton came up the steps from the parking lot carrying 2 leather folders and a thermos of coffee she would never finish. She was all sharp lines and restrained purpose in her dark green coat, her brown hair tied back low, her face alert in the cold. Some people looked softer when they cared. Claire looked more exact. "You both ready?" she asked. No one said yes. That was answer enough. Inside, the courthouse smelled of old paper, radiator heat, and floor polish. The hearing room was smaller than Elias had imagined, and that somehow made it worse. There was no grandeur to hide behind. No distance big enough to turn pain into ceremony. Just wood benches, a raised bench at the front, flags standing in still corners, and the heavy air of decisions made by people who had to keep their own feelings from staining the record. Calder was already there. He sat beside his attorney with his overcoat folded across the back of the chair, looking as controlled as ever, though not as untouchable. He wore a charcoal suit, white shirt, dark tie, and the expression of a man who still believed civility could outlast evidence. His attorney, Martin Keene, was new to Elias. Keene was in his early 50s, tall and thin, with a long face made sharper by a clipped salt-and-pepper beard and eyes like polished slate. He had the dry patience of a man who had spent years defending ugly conduct behind clean language. Everything about him suggested intelligence in service of detachment. the kind of lawyer who did not need to like his clients in order to preserve them. At the bench sat Judge Eleanor Pike, a woman in her late 60s with silver hair cut close to the jaw and a face lined by years of hearing people lie in complete sentences. She was not severe in the theatrical sense. She was worse for men like Calder, attentive. She had the posture of a former farm girl who had learned the law without surrendering the plain instinct to recognize when something smelled wrong. When the hearing began, there was no swell of music in Elias's blood, no cinematic clarity. Only the slow tightening of muscles in his neck and shoulders, while Claire laid out the case, piece by piece. She did not speak dramatically. She spoke as though building a structure the room could inspect. Miriam Vance was 74 years old. She had been living alone. She had recent medical vulnerability and was using multiple prescriptions on the date in question. The documents placed before her were complex and property-related. The signing did not occur in her home or in the expected county office. The documents were not clearly read aloud. No copy had been meaningfully explained or left with her. The transfer benefited a neighboring land buyer with a growing financial interest in connecting lake parcels. Then Claire said the words that shifted the room. "This case is not about whether a signature exists. It is about whether consent did." Martin Keene rose almost lazily after that, as though the burden of contradiction amused him. He did not attack Miriam with cruelty. He attacked with refinement, which was worse. Miriam, he said, remained ambulatory. She was not declared incompetent. She signed her name. There was no allegation of physical force. No witness claimed to have heard threats. Mr. Vance, her son, had been absent for nearly a year and now sought to reinterpret adult decisions through guilt and hindsight. Some of Claire's early exhibits were weakened under objection. A few notes were labeled incomplete. One photocopy was admitted only provisionally. Elias felt every sustained objection like a small, clean cut. Good, he thought grimly. Let it be hard. Let it be real. Then Miriam took the stand. She looked so small there that Elias had to press his hands flat against his knees to keep from moving. Her voice at first barely carried. She forgot a date, misremembered the order of one appointment, said, "I think," more than once, and every time she did, Martin Keene's pen moved across his page with quiet satisfaction. For one dreadful stretch, it seemed the room might reduce her again, the way Calder had reduced her, the way towns and systems always did, into a confused old woman who had once trusted the wrong person and must now live with it. Claire saw it too. So she changed course. No more broad questions. No more invitations to narrate. "Mrs. Vance," Claire said gently, "when you signed, were you wearing your glasses?" "No." "Did anyone place them in your hand?" "No." "Who held the papers?" "Calder." "Did you believe you were selling your house?" Miriam blinked, then shook her head. "No, I believed I was protecting it." "Did anyone say the word sale to you?" "No." "Did anyone say the word deed?" A pause. Miriam's hand tightened on the witness rail. Elias saw Ranger lying beneath the counsel table at Claire's feet, lift his head as if the whole room had taken one breath together. "Yes," Miriam said softly, "but not like stealing, like saving." The judge's face did not move, but her attention sharpened almost visibly. Claire kept going. "What did the car smell like?" Martin rose at once. "Relevance?" Claire turned slightly. "Foundational memory, Your Honor. We're assessing clarity and context." Judge Pike nodded once. "I'll allow it." Miriam frowned in concentration. "Smoke, wet wood, old coffee." "Did the woman reading the papers read every page aloud?" "No." "Did you leave with a full copy?" "No." "Were you tired?" That brought the first tremor to Miriam's mouth. "I was ashamed," she said. "That's not the same thing, but it sits in the same chair." Even Martin Keene did not object to that. Perhaps he knew some truths damaged the man beside him simply by existing in the open. Lydia Hargrove's testimony came next, and the room changed again. She walked to the stand in a navy coat too thin for the weather and sat with both hands gripping each other so hard the knuckles blanched. Her blonde-gray hair had been combed carefully, but anxiety had already loosened strands around her temples. She looked like a woman who had spent several nights discovering that guilt kept worse hours than fear. Claire did not soften for her. "Mrs. Hargrove, did you witness the signing?" "Yes." "Did Mrs. Vance appear fully oriented to the nature of the transaction?" Lydia swallowed. Her eyes flickered toward Calder, then away so quickly it was answer enough. "She appeared tired," Lydia said. "That was not my question." A long silence followed. Then Lydia did something Elias had not expected. She turned, not toward Claire, but toward Miriam. "No," she said, her voice shaking. She did not seem to understand what was being put in front of her, and I knew that. The room went absolutely still. Lydia's next words came faster, as if once the door opened, truth feared being shut back in. "Mr. Thorne controlled the papers. He summarized them. I did not read every page. I should have. I did not ask enough. I should have. I told myself it was family business, and I was there for form, not substance." That confession did not redeem her, but it fractured something larger than her own cowardice. Owen Bell followed with what Elias privately thought of as the geometry of suspicion. Owen's voice never rose. He simply explained, line by line, why the document package was excessive for the purpose Miriam believed it served, why the setting of the signature was irregular, why certain procedural choices created opacity instead of clarity. He made exploitation sound as dry as bookkeeping, and somehow that made it more damning. Then Dr. Naomi Pierce testified. Calm, measured, impossible to rattle, she explained how medication could slow comprehension in an elderly patient under pressure, not incapacitate, not erase agency, simply reduce the ability to process layered legal language in unfamiliar surroundings. That distinction mattered. It kept the case from becoming melodrama. It made it law. Martin Keene cross-examined each witness skillfully, shaving edges where he could. Lydia admitted no direct threats. Naomi admitted Miriam could still make ordinary decisions. Owen conceded irregular was not automatically illegal. By then, Elias understood the shape of truth in court. It did not arrive whole. It survived by accumulation. The last turn came from the old postal evidence. Harlan Vick was not elegant on the stand, but he was exact. He testified that letters in Miriam's handwriting had been routed badly, returned inconsistently, and in one instance gone missing before ordinary logging. Claire produced the unsigned draft Miriam had written, along with the old postal marking from another returned envelope. Not enough to prove theft by itself. Enough to suggest something unnatural in the break between Miriam's suspicion and Elias's ignorance. Martin objected. Judge Pike overruled part, admitted part, and took the rest for weight rather than certainty. Still, the air had changed. Calder felt it. For the first time, he lost the perfect stillness of his posture. One hand moved to straighten his cuff, then stilled when he realized he'd done it. When arguments closed, the room fell into that terrible waiting silence only courts knew how to create. Public, formal, and intimate all at once. Judge Pike did not speak immediately. She reviewed her notes, glasses low on her nose, while every person in the room sat inside their own pulse. At last she looked up. "This court is not making a final finding on all ownership issues today," she said. "But the record before me establishes substantial concern as to the validity and transparency of the transaction process." Her voice was dry, precise, immovable. She ordered an immediate temporary stay on any further transfer, development, or encumbrance tied to Miriam's property. She authorized temporary restoration of her right to reside on the premises pending deeper civil review and referred the broader matter for examination under statutes concerning exploitation of a vulnerable adult. Additional document production was required. Timelines were set. Nothing was fully won. But the door had opened. Calder's face did not collapse. Men like him rarely shattered where others could watch. Yet something in him hardened the wrong way, like glass under sudden heat. Outside, the cold struck like a second verdict. Miriam stood on the courthouse steps beneath the pale winter sky, one hand pressed over her mouth, her eyes red-rimmed but dry. She did not look triumphant. She looked stunned in the quiet way of a person who had been spoken over for so long that being heard felt almost like a foreign language. Elias stepped beside her. He did not say, "We won." They had not. Not fully. He only looked at her, and in that look passed everything he could not speak in front of the courthouse, the lawyers, the county, the whole frozen machinery of public judgment. Miriam lowered her hand at last. For the first time since Brightwater had let her become small, she did not seem diminished by the world around her. She seemed named again. Ranger stood between them, breath ghosting in the cold, eyes steady on the road ahead. The winter had not ended, but justice at last had begun to move. The final order came down on a Thursday morning under a sky the color of pale steel. No thunder followed it. No choir of justice rose from the courthouse roof. Brightwater did not stop moving in reverence. Men still hauled feed sacks from truck beds. Women still stood outside the bakery with paper cups warming their hands. The lake still held the same cold blue silence it had carried all winter. But something that had been bent for too long had finally begun to straighten. The transaction transferring Miriam Vance's home had been set aside. Further review had done what first hearings only hinted at: the irregular notary procedure, the misleading language around the deed, the inflated urgency of the tax situation, the manipulation of a vulnerable older woman in a state of confusion and shame, the strange breaks in her attempts to reach her son. Piece by piece, the clean face Calder Thorne had worn for years had cracked until the machinery beneath it could no longer pretend to be kindness. Ownership of the house returned to Miriam. The man who had once spoken like a benefactor now faced civil exposure, possible financial penalties, and the slow collapse of the reputation he had cultivated so carefully. That was how men like Calder usually fell, not in a dramatic public howl, but in widening circles of silence, abandoned by the same polished confidence that once made everyone else feel small. Elias heard the news in Claire Sutton's office above the florist. Claire stood by the window with the written order in one hand and her reading glasses in the other. She was still composed, still spare and intelligent in her dark turtleneck and fitted winter coat. But there was a looseness in her shoulders now, the first true release Elias had seen in her. She had spent weeks holding facts in place against the erosion of doubt. Now, at last, the facts had held. "It's done," she said. "Not we won, not congratulations." Claire was too honest for language that might swell beyond the shape of the moment, but the two words landed with more force than anything grander could have managed. Miriam sat in the chair opposite the desk, with both hands folded over her handbag. She had dressed carefully that morning, gray wool coat, blue scarf mended at the edge, hair pinned back with the same quiet discipline she used when she wanted to feel like herself again. She did not speak at once. Her mouth parted slightly. Her eyes shone, but she did not cry. Elias stood beside her, one hand resting at Ranger's neck. The German shepherd, now filling out again after regular food and warmth, had regained the breadth through his chest that hardship had stripped away. His black and tan coat lay thick and clean, his ears upright, his amber eyes bright with the serious patience that had carried him through every chapter of their winter. At the words, "It's done," he did not bark or jump. He only leaned once, a little more of his weight into Elias's leg, as if some long-held tension in him had finally found a place to go. Miriam drew in a slow breath. "So I can go home," she said. Claire nodded. "Yes, fully, lawfully, and this time no one can turn the key against you." That was when the tears came, not dramatically, not all at once. They gathered in Miriam's eyes as if they had traveled a very great distance to reach the surface. Elias knelt beside her chair and took her hand. It was colder than it should have been, even inside a heated room. Older, yes, thinner, yes, but steady, still capable of holding truth after being forced to carry humiliation. "We'll go today," he said. Miriam looked at him, and in that look was gratitude, exhaustion, love, and something gentler than victory. It was the face of a woman who had not asked life to make her heroic and had survived anyway. The drive back to the lake felt longer than it should have. not because the road had changed, but because returning to a place after grief had passed through it was always slower than leaving. Even hope moved carefully around old wounds. Brightwater was quiet that afternoon. News had already traveled, as news in small towns always did, but no one stepped into the road to stop them. A few people lifted hands from porches. A few looked away in embarrassment. A few simply stood still as the truck passed, their silence no longer cruel, only ashamed. June Bell waited at the roadside near the turnoff with 2 paper bags balanced against her hip. She had flour on one sleeve and wind in her chestnut hair, and there was something brighter in her face than Elias had seen there in months. Not smugness, relief. The relief of a decent person who had feared the world might remain exactly as ugly as it first revealed itself to be. "I brought bread," she said when they stopped, "and cinnamon rolls, because your mother deserves sweet things without apology." Miriam laughed then, softly, through the remains of tears. June bent through the window and kissed her cheek. "Go on," she said, "before I start crying too and ruin all my good sense." Owen Bell arrived not long after them in his old truck, bringing a metal box of corrected records, copies, and certified documents sealed in stiff manila envelopes. Even on a day like this, he looked exactly like himself. Tall, spare, disciplined, his iron-gray hair combed back, his long face unreadable. But when he handed the box to Elias, he held it for just a fraction of a second, longer than necessary. "Put this somewhere dry," he said, "and this time keep duplicates." "I will," Elias said. Owen cleared his throat. "Your mother was always the most careful bookkeeper in town. Glad the county finally caught up to her standards." That was as close to tenderness as the man probably came in public. The house stood waiting under a low wash of winter sun. When Elias parked by the fence and cut the engine, no one moved at first. The lake behind the house was a sheet of cold blue light, and the birches along the slope clicked softly in the wind. The porch was weathered, the rail slightly crooked, one shutter hanging lower than it should. Yet the place did not look ruined. It looked interrupted. Miriam opened the truck door before Elias could come around to help her. She stood in the yard very still, one gloved hand pressed lightly against her mouth, her eyes fixed on the front door. Ranger stepped down after her and did something none of them expected. He did not run ahead. He walked to the porch, climbed the 3 wooden steps, then stopped directly before the door and sat. Just sat, straight-backed, unmoving, eyes on Miriam. Like a sentinel refusing to cross the threshold before the rightful heart of the house returned. The wind moved through the trees. Somewhere far across the lake, a gull cried once. Miriam took one step forward, then another. By the time she reached the porch, she was crying openly but quietly, and Ranger did not move until her hand touched the door. Only then did he rise. It was such a simple moment. A dog? A door? An old woman with a shaking hand on the knob. But Elias felt it in the deep place where duty and love had become almost the same thing. Some creatures knew belonging more faithfully than people did. The door opened with a dry wooden sigh. Inside, the house smelled of cedar, dust, old sunlight, and a winter's worth of absence. Miriam entered first. That mattered to Elias. Not symbolically, morally. She stood in the front room for a long time without speaking, her hand moving from the doorframe to the wall, then to the back of the chair near the stove, then to the edge of the window over the lake. She touched everything as if taking attendance among the remains of her own life. "This mark," she said faintly, brushing one finger over a scratch on the kitchen table. "You made when you were 9 and thought a pocket knife counted as woodworking." Elias smiled despite himself. "You told me it gave the table character." "It gave the table a wound," she said, and for the first time in weeks there was humor in her voice. Ranger went room to room with measured steps. No frantic searching, no restless alarm. He nosed the hallway runner, paused at the stove, circled once in Miriam's bedroom, then finally returned to the front porch and lay down in the very place he used to wait each evening, years ago, half in sun, half in shadow. As if his post had simply been restored. The work of repair began that same day. Elias started with what could be made right by hand, rehanging the loose shutter, reinforcing the back gate, clearing debris from the porch steps, lifting the warped mailbox post, and setting it straight again. He moved with the steady, practiced economy of a man who had learned long ago that love often looked like maintenance before it looked like speech. Over the next week, the house slowly resumed the shape of home. He repaired the porch rail and replaced 2 cracked panes in the front window. He cleaned the chimney pipe and restored the wood stove to safe use. He fixed the kitchen hinge that had been whining for years. He patched the fence where rot had crept along the base. Each repair was small. None of them erased what had happened, but together they said what words could not. You were worth returning for. This place was worth setting right. And Brightwater, awkwardly, haltingly, began to return too. June brought loaves of bread and jars of soup, pretending she was only getting rid of extras when no one believed her. Marlene Pike from the bakery appeared one afternoon with a tin of shortbread and an apology that came out in fragments, the way honest regret often did when pride had delayed it too long. Harlan Vick from the post office sent a fresh brass house number plate without a note. Toby Wren from the gas station helped Elias carry lumber from the truck to the shed, all elbows and shy good intent. Even Sheriff Daniel Hart stopped by once, hat in hand, his broad face set in the grim humility of a man not proud of how long it had taken him to see clearly. He did not ask forgiveness directly. Perhaps he knew some things were not his to request. He simply said, "If you need escort presence while things settle, you call," and left before the conversation could become easier than it deserved. Miriam did not turn into a public symbol. That was never who she was. She came back to herself the way winter light came back to a room after curtains were opened, slowly, without spectacle. She began making tea in the blue kettle again. She folded the dish towels in thirds. She rewrote the household ledger in a clean new book Claire had given her. She stood on the porch in the mornings and called Ranger in the same calm voice she had used before anyone ever tried to erase her. At dusk, she sometimes sat by the window with her sewing basket and mended things that were not urgent enough to need mending. Elias understood that, too. Restoration was not always practical. Sometimes it was spiritual muscle, learned again through the hands. One evening, while he replaced a loose porch board and the last light turned the lake gold, Miriam came out wrapped in her gray shawl and sat down in the old chair beside the door. "You know," she said after a while, "I used to think courage meant surviving what came." Elias drove another nail flush with the wood. "What do you think now?" She watched Ranger stretched between them, eyes half closed, warmed by the fading sun. "I think sometimes courage means staying after the danger is over," she said, "letting yourself belong again." Elias set the hammer down. He had been turning over his own future in silence for days. Orders could still come. Work still waited. The life he had built away from Brightwater had not disappeared just because the house had returned. But something in him had shifted beyond rearranging. He had spent years mistaking distance for necessity. Years treating love as a thing that could be scheduled around service. Now, watching his mother on the porch and the dog between them and the lake beyond, he understood that some battles were not won by force or endurance or even justice. Some were won by remaining. "I'm staying longer," he said. Miriam looked at him but did not smile too quickly. She knew enough not to crowd fragile truths. "For a while?" she asked. "For as long as staying is the right thing." She nodded once, as though she had known before he did. The final light stretched over the water, warm and low. Ranger shifted, then settled more fully between them. No one spoke after that. The quiet no longer felt like loss. It felt completed. And in that soft, gold-ending hour, with the house whole around them and the cold held gently beyond the porch, the truth of it became simple enough to bear. Some homes are saved not by timber or law alone, but by love refusing to let a human soul be erased from the place it was meant to belong. This story reminds us that evil does not always arrive with violence. Sometimes it comes quietly, wearing a polite smile, hiding behind papers, pressure, and silence. But this story also shows something just as powerful. Love can be quiet too and still be stronger. A son came home. A faithful dog refused to leave. A mother, though wounded and humiliated, never let go of her dignity. And in the end, truth did not die. It waited, it endured, and it rose. The lesson is simple but deep. Never underestimate the power of staying faithful to what is right. Sometimes justice does not come in a single dramatic moment. Sometimes it comes slowly, like winter thawing under the first light of spring. It comes through courage, patience, compassion, and the refusal to give up on the people we love. There is also something holy in this story. Not every miracle looks like fire from heaven. Sometimes a miracle is a door opening again. Sometimes it is the strength to keep going one more day. Sometimes it is a faithful dog guarding a broken heart until help returns. And sometimes it is God moving through ordinary people, through memory, through mercy, through timing, through truth, until what was stolen is restored. God may not always work quickly, but He is never absent. Even in silence, He is still writing. In everyday life, many people are carrying hidden battles. Some are lonely, some are ashamed, some are waiting for someone to notice what they are too tired to explain. This story asks us to be more attentive, more compassionate, and more willing to stand up when someone vulnerable is being pushed aside. A phone call, a visit, a kind word, a brave action, or simply choosing not to look away may become the very thing God uses to change someone's life. If this story touched your heart, please share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave a comment and tell us what part moved you most, or where you are watching from. And if you believe stories like this matter, please subscribe to the channel so more people can find faith, comfort, and encouragement here. May God bless every person watching. May He protect your home, strengthen your heart, heal what has been broken in your life, and guide your steps through every dark season until light returns again.